Hey, students, it's Mr. Ross. We're in the life science unit right now, and what we've been talking about is the fact that eventually everything goes extinct, which is a sad fact. But the second thing that we kind of brought up was there are ways to hopefully stave off extinction and to help your species survive longer. You should have gotten out of the stuff that we did that you can usually survive longer on average, again, if there is more biodiversity in your population. The big reason for that should be that more biodiversity means there's more possible traits that could deal with environmental changes going on. So even if one person dies or one animal dies from this cause over here, sorry, I got to get in screen. There might be one over here that has like a totally different trait, and it can survive that with whatever trait or characteristic or adaptation it does have. Okay, so more biodiversity does help. But the question that we had after that is, well, where do you get biodiversity from, and how do you determine like which biodiverse traits are going to be good and which ones are going to be bad? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're actually going to take a look at a quick example that's going to lead into what we're talking about. All right, so a first hook here is going to be, which of these organisms do you think is the ancestor of the dolphin? We talked already about this concept of extinction. Everything goes extinct eventually. So what is it that allows certain things to survive? Well, we said they have to have the adaptations that will allow them to survive. If your adaptations don't align with your environment, then you go extinct. So if the environment just changes, then things would go extinct unless they have some way to change with the environment. So which of these things do you think is the ancestor of the dolphin? It has to be different than the dolphin. So take a quick guess. All right, let's go through and see. Number one, that's an ichthyosaur, not closely related to dolphins. It's actually a reptile. Number two, this is an ancestor of, not the dolphin, sorry, the sea lion. This one, number three, this is actually a picture of a monk seal, something that is endangered today, but not related to the dolphin very closely. This next one, so we got it down to 4 and 5. Andrewsarchus, which looks kind of like a cat and a crocodile had a baby together. It's weird. And then this other one, this is actually the ancestor of the manatee, number 5 here. So which one is the ancestor of the dolphin? Yeah, number 4. So the question becomes, how in the world did we get from this thing that looks more like a tiger or something like that to something that looks more like a fish? Okay. There has to be some way for these things to change. And that's what we're going to be talking about today with the concepts of evolution and natural selection. So a little bit of history on this. Before we had the theory of evolution and natural selection, the prevailing theory was this thing called creationism. And it was this idea that was based on just God making everything in a static or unchanging form. The timeline, therefore, was also based on biblical genealogies, which said that the earth was about 6,000 years old. But in the 17 and 1800s, scientists started getting geologic data that said, well, for all of this stuff to have happened that we're finding in the geologic record, there had to have been way more time than just 6,000 years. So the real problem with creationism was two things. Number one, the timeline on it. And then number two, it was the problem that it said all of these creatures were created in a static form, meaning they did not change. So, the elephants of the past were the elephants of today, and the fish of the past were the fish of today. And there was no wiggle room for change. And that's actually the big problem. So scientists started to think that organisms did change over time. And we had this guy who came along named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And in 1809, he presented one of the first theories that said organisms can change over time. Now, people already knew that they inherited their traits from their parents. Kids look like their parents. We have a lot in common with our relatives. So we knew that there was some kind of pattern of inheritance. We just didn't know what it was yet. We'll learn later in the year about this thing called genetics, which you've probably heard of before. But they didn't know about all of the genetic stuff that we know about now. So what Lamarck's theory said was that animal populations evolve because they acquire these adaptations during their lifetime, and then they pass them down from parent to offspring. So his big example was this giraffe. So there would have been short giraffes in the past, and these are the short giraffes right here. And over a long period of time, some of them started stretching their necks longer and longer so that they could reach the food that was higher up in the trees. And then, after a lifetime of stretching their necks out, they maybe acquired like a centimeter longer neck. But they would pass this down to their offspring. And so their offspring had a 2 centimeter long neck. And then they keep stretching. It's another centimeter out on top. So over many, many generations, they could have added more and more centimeters of length to the neck. So you could have gone from this thing that looks like a short necked giraffe to what we have today, which is a very long necked giraffe. Okay. Um, so again, they're passing on these traits that are acquired during their lifetime. There should actually be some problems that are coming to your mind. You should be thinking of some examples that maybe disprove this. So try and think of something real quick. If you need to pause the video, please do so. Do you think of any examples where a parent has an adaptation that they acquired during their lifetime, a trait that they acquired? It's not something that they were born with, and they can't pass it on to their kids. Think of one. All right, so here's the deal. If you've thought of a trait that was not able to be passed down to offspring, good job. But let's take a look at a couple examples. Lamarck was very easily proven wrong. So the first thing here is if your dad has his leg cut off, does this mean that when you're born, you're only going to have one leg? If he's super muscular, does that mean you're going to be born super muscular? No. There are some things that we acquire during our lifetimes, like a tan, for example, and you can't necessarily pass that same characteristic down to your offspring. The big thing that Lamarck was right about, though, is populations change. They just don't change in one lifetime. Parents pass on the changes that they have in their genetics, but they don't pass on changes that they acquired during their lifetime. Okay. So our next guy that's going to come along, which is one of our hunks of science, is Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin sailed on a ship called the Beagle for 5 years around the world when he was 22 years old. His job was to be the naturalist. He was the guy who studied the natural world. He collected all sorts of things in geology, like fossils and rocks, and he drew pictures of all the animals and things that he saw, plants. And the initial question that he had when he set out on his journey was, why is there so much waste in nature? This is a problem that scientists have struggled with when trying to reconcile religion with just science in general. If you look at it, there's all sorts of waste in nature. Now, ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves. You might need to hold onto your seat, but here is our first picture of our new hunk of science, Charles Darwin. Control yourselves. Oh, yeah. Mutton chops to die for. And a receding hairline. You're welcome. All right. Now, again, you're going to have lots and lots of these pictures, so you may just have to buckle in. Okay. The perceived waste that Darwin was looking at, and sorry for the issue here, there were things like thousands of pollen grains made by a flower, but only a few of them end up actually fertilizing to make a new seed for another flower. There are hundreds of eggs that are laid by insects and turtles and things like that, but only a few of them survive to adulthood. I heard a statistic for the turtles the other day that I didn't realize, but 1 out of every 2,000 might make it to adulthood. That's a lot of wasted eggs. So what's going on there? Darwin also was questioning this idea of creationism because of the age of the earth. He had read some of the stuff that other people had written, like Lyell and Hutton, who we talked about in the earth science units. And they said that the earth had to have been millions of years old. So he's questioning creationism initially because he sees this, waste, and because he's also seeing, the earth's age has to be really old. He found fossils of creatures that were really, really old, and it just didn't make sense to him. So there we go. Second picture. Ooh, black and white. What a looker. All right. So here's where the Beagle sailed when it went around the world. It started up in England, went down the South American tip, Tierra del Fuego, up through the coastline of South America on the west side, and then to these islands called the Galapagos. We're going to talk about the Galapagos because they were pretty important to his work. Then he sailed off over to Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Tasmania, and then all the way around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, back up to England again. So this is a 5-year journey, and Darwin had lots and lots and lots of data. In the Galapagos, though, Darwin observed many diverse organisms and fossils. when you look at the Galapagos Islands, they're just a couple little islands, and they're actually a hot spot. For those of you guys who remember, that means or don't remember, that's islands that are created when heated magma punctures through the crust, and then as the crust moves due to plate tectonics, the hot spot stays in the same place, and so it punctures and creates new islands. So we have some big ones, some small ones, but most of them have totally different habitats on them. Like some of them are deserts, some of them are rainforests, some of them are grasslands. But he just collected a lot of different things there. Old Darwin, not bad either. Don't look into his eyes, you'll get mesmerized. That's why we put the hat there. Okay. Darwin realized on each island that there were these birds, though, that were very closely related. They looked very similar other than their beaks. Okay, so each island had its own kind of bird, and these were finches, and each island's finch had its own separate kind of beak. That was the major difference between them. Darwin, epic beard. So when Darwin returned home, he had lots of information, but one of the questions that stuck with him eventually, because he went off and did a bunch of other things like talking about barnacles and weird stuff like that. He questioned, why did the beaks change from one island to the other? And what he hypothesized, and maybe you should probably think about this too, is they had different foods. So birds use their beaks to get their food, right? They don't like grab them with their wings or anything most of the time. They eat it with their beaks. So different foods on different islands must have created the different beaks. That was kind of his hypothesis. So he used these writings by this guy named Thomas Malthus, who was an economist, and he had gone on to say like the Earth's human civilization was going to collapse in the 1700s because there wouldn't be enough food, and obviously that hasn't happened yet. But his real writing goal, or sorry, the real, I guess, gift that he gave to Darwin through his writings was that he had this idea of limiting factors, which means that there's not enough of some, thing in the environment for everybody to survive. So it might be not enough food, not enough water. There might be too much disease. Right now we're going through COVID-19, so everybody's freaking out about that. How wonderful. But this idea of limiting factors, there will be things in the environment that prevent the population from growing too much. So Darwin took all these ideas, and here he is again. He's got a sensitive side too. Okay. So real quick, what were some of the observations that Darwin had that led to his theory of evolution? Okay. All right. Some of the different things that he had were he observed the beak finches on different islands. He observed that there was all this waste in nature. He was observing things from the geologic record that were like really old and it couldn't have been, a 6,000-year-old Earth. So he had a lot of observations that led to his theory. But eventually his theory was developed and it was called the origin of species by natural selection. Origin of species is this idea that organisms are all descended from one common ancestor. Now, we don't know what that ancestor was. This is kind of one of those challenging parts of the theory. We can never get back to that one ancestor. But Darwin never actually used the term evolution. He said descent with modification. Now, try and take a second. Why do you think we shouldn't use the term evolution? Like, what are some connotations that come along with evolution that might not actually be true? When you get down to it, evolution has this idea that you're always getting better and that you're changing for the better. Well, that's not necessarily what evolution means. Sometimes things change and we would perceive it to not be better, but it actually helps the organism survive better. So evolution is not the correct term. Darwin actually didn't coin that term himself. I think it was a guy named Huxley who used that, I believe. But he used the term descent with modification. His theory is really called the origin of species by natural selection, okay, by descent with modification. All right. Shh, don't speak. Gotta listen now. Okay, so what's evolution? Evolution is any change in the traits or frequency of traits in a generation across a time span. Wow, that's a mouthful. Here's your 8th grade definition. Populations change their overall traits from one generation to the next over time. The example here is if I have a million dandelions in my yard, some of them might be long, some might be short, some might be medium length. If I go and I mow my lawn, I'm going to cut down all the really tall ones, and the only ones that'll be able to reproduce are the short ones. So over several seasons, I might be left with more really short dandelions. That's evolution. It's not like I created a new species. I don't want you to get that misconception. It's not that we are creating a brand new species. It's just a change in our species. Okay. So Darwin, he sailed on the Beagle for 5 years. He took 2 years before he came up with this idea of natural selection that we'll talk about later for how evolution works. And he didn't publish his work for a long time after that. Some people have said it was because he was lazy or that he would get off task really badly. So some of you guys who get off task all the time in class, don't feel too bad. You can still accomplish great things. But then if you look at the last date here, 13 years after his first edition of, well, it's actually 12 and a half years ish, after his first edition of On the Origin of Species, Darwin is still publishing more data to address many objections that people had about his theory. Darwin was never worried about the religious aspects of his theory. From the beginning, he actually had some people who supported his work in the religious community and said that it made their understanding of God much more complete. His worry was all the scientists who would be out there who would come out with all these objections, and we're going to talk about some of those objections later that people had. All right, but here's some of the evidence that he had. The first thing was homologous structures, and a lot of scientists knew about these things for a while. When you look at like the arm of a man, the leg of a cow, the leg of a horse, the whale's flipper, and then this says bird, but it's actually a bat's wing. They all have a very similar structure, even though they're not the same species. They have one long bone, two long bones, and then a bunch of little ones. One, two, bunch of little ones. One, two, bunch of little ones. Why is this? Well, Darwin would say because they had a common ancestor that had that same pattern, and that pattern just got modified over many, many generations in different lineages. So one lineage, the man lineage, modified this set of bones to carry stuff and punch things and high five and do all that kind of stuff. Cows and horses, they modified theirs to, walk and to run on land. When you look at the horse, it has just one big toe. That's essentially what a hoof is. It's a big toe. Whales, they modified theirs to have really, really long fingers and to be more flexible on those long finger parts, but to have shorter, stouter parts near their body because that's where their power comes from as they kind of flip their flippers. Bats, they needed really skinny ones that were longer so that they could have all that skin tissue in between. So Darwin is saying homologous structures are because they have a shared ancestor that had that same pattern. And there's this other thing called an analogous structure. Oops, my bad. Sorry. An analogous structure is where you have the same purpose, but a totally different function or feature structure. So when you look at like the wings of a bat versus the wings of a butterfly, they both help them fly, but they're totally different structures. That is not evolution evidence per se, but homologous structures are. Okay. This other one is a picture of a bunch of modified leaves. So flowers, cactus spines, the Venus flytrap's mouth, the pitcher plant, all of those are actually just leaves that have been modified over time. Every single one of them came from a common ancestor, whatever the ancestor of plants that had leaves was. And they have just modified this over many, many generations to serve different purposes. Okay. The other piece of evidence is these things called transitional forms. And a transitional form shows an intermediate stage between an ancestor and a later generation. Let's take a look at the dolphin example. So we had that cat crocodile thing at the beginning, and that would be down here in the bottom center. And over time, maybe some of the creatures had legs that were farther back that made them better at swimming. And then other ones, their legs got even shorter. And the process by which this happens, we're going to talk about in a little bit, but the sneak preview here is they have to have variety in the population, and then some of the varieties are more favorable, and so they get selected to survive better, and those varieties just continue to down. So when you look at these transitional forms, though, the key here is there's a change that happens, stepping stones towards what we have now. So when you look at the Pachycetus, its nostrils are near the front of its head, whereas when you look at a gray whale, its nostrils are like way back near its eyes on the top of its head. Well, that transition had to happen at some point. The nostril is moving farther and farther and farther and farther back. And why would that happen? Well, because, if you're going into the water, it's better to have your nostril on top of your head because you can breathe out of it without having to take your whole head out of the water. Okay. On the left here, we also have some examples of horse hooves. If you look at horses today, they really only have one toe. But when you go farther back, their ancestors had three toes, two of which were kind of off the ground. Go even farther, three toes that were all touching the ground. If you go even farther, four toes. This is a change in environment. Horses lived in swampy woodland areas where you would need to kind of be a little bit more nimble, and they were much smaller. And so four toes was better in that environment. When the environment changed to be a little bit more grassy and hard, like the grasslands that horses run around on now, they needed just one toe. It actually was an advantage to them. Okay. Archaeopteryx here, if you look at it, do you think that it is a bird or a reptile? Okay. Well, actually, it's kind of both. If you look, it has like a long, flexible tail. It's got claws. It's got teeth that are inset into its mouth, just like a reptile, but it also has feathers. So it's a transition between birds and dinosaurs. Okay. Here is a bird called a hoatzin on the left here that looks very similar. It's got claws on the front. The other thing that it has, when you look at it, is kind of all this fluff and everything. It's kind of what ancestral feathers look like. Most feathers on dinosaurs did not look kind of like the feathers that we have today. So there's actually an evolution of feathers, a change in the feathers over time too. One of the other pieces of evidence was these things called vestigial structures, which showed that we had creatures that had been descended from other creatures. So when you look at humans, actually, we have a tailbone. Why is that? Because we have a common ancestor somewhere in the past that had a tail. When you look at whales, they have these bones kind of near the back of their spines that don't do anything. And when you look at them, they're actually hip bones. They're things that were there because their ancestors had them. Their ancestors walked on land, as we saw a little bit ago. But there's, really a bunch of bones there that are useless. So this is kind of the idea that if you're not going to use that adaptation, it's eventually going to go away because it'll lose its purpose. And we actually have lots and lots of examples of these vestigial structures. So think of maybe a couple things that are vestigial structures in humans. Some examples of things that you don't use or don't get used very much. Okay, or maybe they even cause problems. And some examples of these might be your wisdom teeth or the appendix, for some of you guys who know what that is. But there are lots and lots of vestigial structures in humans. Here again, people sometimes are born with tails. That's what we call an atavism, though. An atavism is something that is like a throwback. We'll see an example of an atavism later in dolphins too. So the biggest evidence of all, though, that all creatures are descended from one another is that all species have DNA, and it's got essentially the same structure. Why is that? It's because the original ancestor had DNA as its molecule to pass down genetic information. So DNA is just a homologous structure. It's been modified over time. It's been modified in one species versus another, but there are some genes in our DNA that we share with, like bacteria, things that you would think are not even closely related to us. We have genes in common with almost every single species here on Earth. You may not look at an oak tree and think that it's the same as you, but you have some of the same genes that an oak tree does. So quick check. What are the three pieces of evolution and what does the theory say? Okay, some of the pieces of evolution that we went over are homologous structures, vestigial structures, And then transitional forms, those fossils where they have the kind of the in between stepping stones of a modern species to its ancestor species. The theory says that a species will change over time, and that's really what it says. Okay. All right. So now we've said that species change over time, but we have not said kind of how that happens. And what Darwin hypothesized was there was this thing called natural selection. This is what he said was the driving force behind evolution. This quote says individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than members of the same species. So there are going to be five parts here of natural selection. You guys are going to take a look at them. But if I were to summarize this, what I'm going to say is everybody's different, or there should be some differences in the population, and some of the differences will give you an advantage. So the thing that is really in the driver's seat, in my view, for evolution as far as natural selection goes, is the environment. So the environment determines what is a good trait versus what's a bad trait. If the environment changes, something that was a good trait can change to a bad trait. It can turn to a disadvantage. The perfect example here is dinosaurs. Dinosaurs got really, really big at the end of the Cretaceous era. Um, Natural selection was kind of selecting for that. It was helpful to them. But then we had this huge environmental change that wiped out a lot of the food supply. And if you're huge, food is not going to be easy to come by. So all these huge dinosaurs, they kind of got a disadvantage with that big body size because it ended up causing a lot of them to die. They didn't have enough food. So here's the 5 points of natural selection. Populations have variation. Some variations are more favorable. More offspring are produced than will survive, and then organisms compete, and those that have favorable traits will survive and reproduce more. The final thing is the evolution piece. Populations will change over time. Let's take a look at this. If you look, you have green bugs and you have brown bugs. Um, that is the variation there. Some of the variations are favorable. So if there are brown bugs on like tree bark, brown's favorable. Some of the bugs are going to get eaten. Bird comes along. Which one do you think he's going to pick off? Yeah, probably the green ones. When the bugs hide, fewer brown ones are going to be eaten. And then eventually, more brown ones will reproduce, making more brown ones in the next generation. So if they started out 50-50, half brown, half green, the next generation, there's going to actually probably be way more brown ones because a lot of the green ones got eaten. Okay. Here's the example with the finches. Let's pretend there were three different types of beaks: thick, medium, and thin. Thick ones can eat nuts, thin ones can catch insects, and then medium ones are for seeds and fruit. If there was a drought that came along, it might take out all of the fruit and all of the seeds. So, who is going to suffer the most? Well, if you're looking back at number two, the seeds and the fruit are for medium beaks. So, birds that have thick beaks and thin beaks are going to have a food source. Medium beaks, they're not. So, the medium beaks will die out. So, that means in the next generation, there will be more thick and thin beaks and not as many medium beaks. Okay. So, like we said before, the favorability of a trait depends on the environment. If the environment changes, a trait could become bad. For example, white mouse is great in the Arctic, but it'll stick out to a predator if it's in the middle of a green field. So, environment determines your success. When you take a look at that, that actually, whoops, sorry. Where am I? There we go. That actually gives us some weird stuff happening with this thing called convergent evolution. Because the environment is what drives your success, it also kind of drives the adaptation. So we have some things that look very similar to one another, but it's not actually because they're related. It's actually because they have the same environmental pressures that are driving them to success. It can be really hard to tell what is and what is not related now based on just how they look. So usually what we look at as the tiebreaker is what does your genetics say? Like, do you have lots of genes in common? When you look at like sharks, ichthyosaurs, and dolphins, they all have these streamlined bodies. They have some differences for sure, but very long streamlined bodies, dorsal fin, a flipper at the back, a pointed nose. This is because they all have to swim really fast through the water because they're all predators. The same environment, the same food source that has pressured them to have the same look. Okay. When we look at the giant armadillo, the giant anteater, the giant pangolin, and the spiny anteater, also known as the echidna, all of these things are very distantly related, but they all have a long, thin snout. They have really long tongues. They have big claws for essentially breaking into termite mounds and ant hills and things like that for digging. They all have that because they have the same environmental pressure. They eat ants, they eat termites. Okay, that's their food source. So that's what and the environment has selected for in them. Okay, so variation is necessary for selection to occur. What are two different ways that you think we could get this variety into a population? And then how does evolution connect to natural selection? Another way for you to think about this last question is like, which one is the cause and which one is the effect? Is evolution the cause or the effect? Is natural selection cause or effect? Okay. So when we look at this, um, two different ways that we can get variations are through mutations and through sexual reproduction, actually also adds some variety, gives us new combinations of traits. And then for this other question, evolution is the effect, natural selection is kind of the cause. Natural selection happens, and then due to natural selection happening, evolution happens. Okay. Also, children, we don't want you to be selected against. So yeah, don't do dumb stuff. That's why we try to get you guys an education. So just make sure you're taking your education so that you can adapt to the environment as it changes around you. The more that you know, the more you'll be able to do to help yourself there. Darwin actually also looked at some problems. So we said he had some critics early on. One of the critiques was this thing with peacock feathers. Why do peacocks have really long feathers? Their feathers are not really good for getting away from a predator. They actually make it really tough to fly. So why do they have these long feathers? Darwin once said that the sight of a peacock feather actually made him sick. Um, so he took a look at this and he actually found, well, the environment isn't always the thing that selects for the advantageous traits. Some organisms actually get picked based on whether they are more attractive to the opposite sex. So mates sometimes are selected because they have flamboyant displays, or they do dances, or they have really big body features that are impressive to the female, or whatever. But usually, it's a males competing, and then the females getting to choose. That's usually how it goes. Okay. Um, an example of this: when you look at giraffes, why do giraffes have long necks? Well, if you said that it's because they need to eat stuff high up in the trees, that's actually not true. There's plenty of food really low down. And actually, there are studies that show they eat a lot of their food at a height that's lower than their head. So, what's this long neck for? Well, they actually fight with it. And those who fight can actually get a mate, and they protect their territory. And so the long neck is actually not natural selection, it's a sexual selection thing. Longer neck is better at fighting. And so you get to reproduce and pass your genes on to the next generation, and the next generation has more long necks in it. Other examples, again, the peacock. What's this all about? Well, there are studies that show that when a female mates with a peacock, or sorry, a peahen is the female, sorry. When the peahen chooses her peacock that she's going to mate with, she looks at these feathers. They're like a big billboard that says, like, I am super fit, so fit that I can even avoid predators, even though I have these really big feathers that would slow me down and cause me to die. There's actually studies that show also that when they clip the feathers of the big feathered males, they don't get to mate as much, but the babies that they do produce actually survive better than the other ones that had, maybe medium length feathers, but the females chose all those medium length feather ones because they thought that was a better choice. So again, this is kind of an actual show of how healthy a male is. If you clip their feathers, it doesn't change their genetics. So their babies would actually survive better, even though they had shorter feathers. So that shows that the genetics is real there. So Males, again, big showy displays. When you look at cuttlefish, that's an interesting one. The male cuttlefish, they really come in two varieties, big and small. The big ones fight and they protect females. The little ones, they don't get that much of an opportunity to mate. So what they'll do is the little ones will camouflage themselves and look like females, sneak in as the male thinks that he's protecting another female, and then the little guy will mate with all the other females. So there's some trickery there that actually leads to two different kinds of males, big and then small, tricky ones. So, and then male cardinals, they eat berries that will help them have their red plumage. And there is some evidence that those berries, you, even though they make them red, they actually also make the males sick, which is why the females don't eat them. But it's a big sign showing the female, like, I am pretty tough, I'm fit, like, we should have babies together. So sexual selection doesn't always help you survive better, but it does help you get a mate. So there has to be a balance between sexual selection and natural selection. Um, we also get this question of why do we have all these different breeds of things like dogs and all that? Well, when you look at it, humans have selected which traits are good and bad too. The gray wolf is the ancestor of all modern dogs, and from that, we have all of these totally different species of, well, breeds of dog. They're all dogs. They can all breed with each other. Sometimes they need help, which we are not going to get into. But they have the ability to breed, and so they're all the same species. We have selected though dogs that have one trait over another, and we have caused them to breed with other dogs that have that same trait. So, for example, when we started with gray wolves, they might have come around like our ancient like villages or whatever looking for food scraps. The ones that were a little less aggressive just kind of stuck around or maybe followed the people as they traveled. Um, we would take those ones that were less aggressive and keep them around and breed them. And then the ones that were the puppies that were less aggressive, we would breed those. And those puppies that were more aggressive, I don't know, maybe we would kill them or we would cast them out or whatever. Food is another huge example of this artificial selection. Artificial means man made selection. So when you look at the thing on the left here, that is ancient corn. It's not very yummy looking. It's small. There's only a couple kernels. They're hard, but modern corn looks much different. So what we did is as we grew corn, we would select the corn that had bigger kernels, that tasted better, that was less tough, and we would grow those the next year. And that process over many, many generations gave us modern corn. So um, three ways that selection goes on. You can have artificial selection, you can have natural selection, you can have sexual selection. Artificial selection, that's when humans are choosing the traits. Sexual selection is when a mate chooses which trait is best. And then natural selection is when the environment itself chooses what trait is best for survival. Okay. Now, all of this can do some pretty big scale things long term. When you look again, we talked about the horses on the bottom. Over time, they went from 4 toes to just the one big toe. This is the horse lineage, and you've seen they've gotten bigger, they changed size, all that kind of stuff. When you look at elephant evolution, a lot of differences too. Environment has caused big changes, like ear size and tusk shape and nose length and all that stuff. Over time, they've been selected for all these cool different traits that help them survive. And when we look at again the transition from theropod dinosaurs to modern day birds, there's wing evolution up on the top. Sorry. Claws eventually got modified through selection, which claws are better for flying. And then now we have these tiny dinky wings with really, really big feathers that help things fly. So some of the important points here: the environment determines success. If the environment changes, a good trait could become a bad one, vice versa. The success of a species is often tied to diversity. If you have more diversity, you're more successful. If you have less diversity, there's a better chance you might go extinct. All right, so lots of information in our video today on evolution and natural selection. So what are the big takeaways? Big stuff. First of all, evolution is just a change in the species. How does it happen? The environment or a mate or humans sometimes will select which traits are beneficial or which ones help you survive better. And those that survive are the ones that have those favorable traits, and they pass them down to the next generation. You can get some changes that happen in there through mutation and through just sexual reproduction. There can be mutations, and that's how we get new varieties sometimes. Um, so, big idea change. Species change over time. So, if you have questions, email, and I will talk to you guys later.